Imagine being 19 years old and told you have 3 days to prepare for a wedding to a man you've never met. A man 30 years older who owns half the county and has buried 2 wives already. Now imagine trying to escape on horseback in the dead of night, only to find yourself face to face with a mysterious cowboy who changes the course of your entire life. This is the story of how one desperate decision led to the most unexpected love story in the Arizona Territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never seemed to settle in Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, 1887. It swirled around the wooden buildings like ghosts of dreams that died hard in the desert heat. For 19-year-old Isabella Martinez, the dust felt particularly suffocating on that September morning when her father called her into his study with news that would shatter her world. "Mija," Vicente Martinez said, his weathered hands gripping a letter that trembled slightly in the morning light. "Then your Blackwood has made us an offer." Isabella knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew Harrison Blackwood, the cattle baron who owned more land than some eastern states, whose iron-gray mustache and cold blue eyes had intimidated judges, sheriffs and politicians into submission. At 52 years old, he was a man who took what he wanted when he wanted it. "What kind of offer, Papa?" Isabella asked, though the dread in her stomach already whispered the answer. Vicente couldn't see his daughter's eyes. "Marriage, Mia. He wants to marry you." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She gripped the back of the leather chair, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "Marriage? But Papa, I don't even know him. I've never even spoken to the man." "You don't understand." Vicente's voice cracked with desperation. "The bank. They're foreclosing on the ranch next week. Everything we've built, everything your grandfather built, it will all be gone. Senor Blackwood is offering to pay our debts to save the ranch. All he asks in return is your hand." Isabella stared at her father as if seeing a stranger. The man who had taught her to ride, who had praised her intelligence and encouraged her dreams of perhaps becoming a teacher someday, was now bartering her away like cattle. "There has to be another way," she whispered. "We could sell the horses, or there is no other way." Vicente's fist crashed onto the desk, making the inkwell jump. "Do you think I haven't tried everything? The debts are too large, Isabella. Without this marriage, we lose everything. Your mother, your little brother Carlos, where will they go? What will they eat?" Isabella felt the walls of the small study closing in around her. Through the window, she could see her 15-year-old brother Carlos tending to their horses, unaware that his sister's freedom was being negotiated away in hushed tones. Her mother, Elena, was hanging laundry on the line, humming an old Mexican lullaby that suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. "When?" Isabella's voice was barely audible. "Saturday. 3 days from now. 3 days!" 72 hours to say goodbye to the life she had known, the dreams she had cherished, the future she had imagined. Isabella closed her eyes and saw herself as Mrs. Harrison Blackwood, trapped in his grand house on the hill, a trophy wife to be displayed and controlled. She had heard whispers about his previous wives. Margaret Blackwood, his first, had died of a mysterious fever after only 2 years of marriage. Some said she had never recovered from a fall down the main staircase. Sarah Blackwood, his second wife, had lasted 5 years before succumbing to what the doctor called a weak heart. The townspeople whispered different stories, of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of a woman who had grown thin and hollow-eyed before her death. "I need time to think," Isabella managed to say. Vicente's face softened with guilt and desperation. "Mija, I know this is hard, but Senor Blackwood is a powerful man. He can provide for you in ways we never could. You'll have fine dresses, a big house, servants, and a husband I don't love who's old enough to be my father," Isabella finished bitterly. That afternoon, Isabella saddled her horse, a spirited paint mare named Esperanza Hope, and rode out to her favorite thinking spot by Willow Creek. The water bubbled over smooth stones, creating a peaceful melody that usually calmed her troubled mind. Today, even the creek's song couldn't ease the panic that clawed at her chest. She thought about running away. With her skills as a rider and her knowledge of the desert, she might make it to California or perhaps north to Colorado. But the thought of her family facing Harrison Blackwood's wrath without her protection made her stomach turn. Men like Blackwood didn't accept defiance lightly, and her refusal could mean the destruction of not just their ranch, but her family's safety. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Isabella made her way home. The smell of her mother's cooking, beans and fresh tortillas greeted her, but food was the last thing on her mind. "Isabella," Carlos called out as she led Esperanza to the barn. "Papa says we're going to a wedding on Saturday." "Whose wedding is it?" Isabella's heart clenched as she looked at her little brother's eager face. He loved celebrations, loved any excuse for music and dancing. How could she tell him that the wedding would mark the end of their family as they knew it? It's my wedding, Carlos." His face lit up like Christmas morning. "Your wedding? Who are you marrying?" "Is it Miguel from town? He's always making eyes at you when we go to market." Isabella forced a smile. "No, not Miguel. Someone else. Someone you don't know." Dinner that evening was a strained affair. Elena Martinez had clearly been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, despite her attempts to appear cheerful. Vicente ate in silence, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Carlos chattered excitedly about the upcoming wedding, oblivious to the funeral atmosphere that hung over the table. That night, Isabella lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the desert wind howl through the gaps in the adobe walls. She could hear her parents talking in hushed, urgent voices in the next room. "Perhaps there's still time to find another solution," her mother was saying. "Maybe if we spoke to Father Miguel, he could help us find another way." "There is no other way, Elena. I've exhausted every option. The bank won't extend our loan, and no one else in the territory has the money to help us. Blackwood is our only hope. But Isabella is so young, so full of life. To tie her to a man like that, you think I want this?" Vicente's voice broke. "You think I want to give my daughter to that man? But what choice do I have? Would you rather see her homeless, begging in the streets? Would you rather watch Carlos starve?" Isabella pressed her face into her pillow to muffle her sobs. She felt trapped, caught between her love for her family and her terror of the future that awaited her. Sleep finally came near dawn, filled with nightmares of cold blue eyes and iron-gray mustaches. The next morning brought visitors. Harrison Blackwood himself arrived in his gleaming black carriage, accompanied by two of his ranch hands and his lawyer, a thin, nervous man named Pemberton. Isabella watched from her bedroom window as the entourage approached their modest home, her heart hammering against her ribs. Blackwood was even more intimidating in person than she had imagined. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. His expensive suit and polished boots looked out of place against the humble backdrop of the Martinez ranch, like a predator that had wandered into the wrong territory. "Isabella," her mother called softly from the doorway. "Senor Blackwood would like to meet you." With trembling hands, Isabella smoothed her simple blue dress and braided her long black hair. She had dressed as plainly as possible, hoping to appear undesirable, but she knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't about attraction or compatibility, it was about ownership, about adding another possession to Harrison Blackwood's vast collection. The formal introductions took place in their small parlor, the space made even smaller by Blackwood's commanding presence. He looked Isabella up and down like a man inspecting livestock, his cold eyes taking inventory of her assets. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice deep and cultured, with just a hint of an Eastern accent. "I trust your father has explained our arrangement." "Yes, sir," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the fear that coursed through her veins. "Excellent. You'll find that I'm a generous husband to those who please me and a firm one to those who don't. I expect obedience, discretion, and children, preferably sons." In return, you'll want for nothing material. Isabella felt bile rise in her throat at his casual mention of children. The thought of this man's hands on her, of bearing his offspring, made her skin crawl. But she forced herself to nod, knowing that any show of defiance would only make things worse for her family. "I've taken the liberty of having a wedding dress made," Blackwood continued, gesturing to a large box his men had brought in. "It belonged to my late wife Sarah. She was about your size, so it should fit with minimal alterations." The casual mention of his dead wife, the expectation that Isabella would wear her dress, felt like a violation of the deepest kind. She imagined Sarah Blackwood standing where she now stood, young and terrified, perhaps thinking the same desperate thoughts that now raced through Isabella's mind. After Blackwood and his entourage left, Isabella opened the box with shaking hands. Inside was a white silk dress, beautiful and expensive, but somehow malevolent. It felt cold to the touch, and Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that it still held echoes of its previous owner's unhappiness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second night brought even less sleep than the first. Isabella spent the dark hours planning impossible escapes, each scenario ending in disaster for her family. She thought of Miguel Fernandez, the gentle blacksmith's son who had been courting her with shy smiles and awkward conversations. She thought of the books she would never read, the places she would never see, the children she might never love. By Friday evening, the weight of her approaching fate had settled on Isabella's shoulders like a burial shroud. Tomorrow night, she would be Mrs. Harrison Blackwood, trapped in a life that felt worse than death. The wedding dress hung in her closet like a ghost, and every time she looked at it, she imagined Sarah Blackwood's spirit pleading with her to run, to escape while she still could. As the sun set on her last night of freedom, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't save herself, but perhaps she could delay the inevitable long enough for a miracle to occur. If she was going to be trapped, she would at least have one final taste of freedom. She would ride out into the desert one last time, under the cover of darkness, and say goodbye to the life she was leaving behind. It was a small rebellion, perhaps a foolish one, but it was the only choice that felt like her own. Isabella waited until the house fell silent, until she could hear her father's snores, mixing with the desert wind. Then, moving as quietly as a shadow, she slipped from her bed and began to dress for what she believed would be her final ride as a free woman. Isabella pulled on her riding boots and wrapped her darkest shawl around her shoulders. The floorboards creaked softly as she crept through the house, each sound amplified in the midnight silence. Her heart thundered so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire household. But her family's exhausted sleep held firm. In the kitchen, she grabbed a piece of leftover bread and tucked it into her pocket. This wasn't a true escape. She knew she would have to return before dawn, but perhaps in those few stolen hours under the stars, she could find the courage to face what tomorrow would bring. The barn door opened with the softest whisper. Esperanza nickered quietly, sensing her mistress's presence. Isabella pressed her face against the mare's warm neck, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and horse. "One last ride, girl," she whispered. "One last taste of freedom." She saddled Esperanza by feeling alone, her hands working from years of practice. The leather was cool and supple, the buckles familiar as old friends. Every movement felt sacred now, weighted with the knowledge that tomorrow she would belong to Harrison Blackwood. And even these simple pleasures might be forbidden. The desert night embraced them as they slipped away from the ranch. Stars blazed overhead in a canopy so brilliant it seemed close enough to touch. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the sagebrush and cacti. Isabella had always felt most alive in moments like these, alone with her horse and the vast emptiness that stretched to every horizon. They rode toward the old Spanish mission ruins, a place Isabella had discovered as a child and never shared with anyone. The crumbling adobe walls stood about 5 miles northwest of their ranch, abandoned for decades, but still holding traces of the faith and hope that had once filled them. Tonight, it seemed like the perfect place to say her goodbyes. Esperanza's hooves found sure footing on the rocky trail, her breathing steady and calm. The mare seemed to understand the solemnity of this journey, picking her way carefully through the desert terrain without needing guidance from the reins. As they crested a low ridge, Isabella saw something that made her pull Esperanza to a halt. Below, in a natural hollow protected by towering rock formations, flickered the orange glow of a campfire. Someone was there, in her secret place, in the spot where she had planned to spend these final precious hours. Her first instinct was to turn back, but curiosity held her frozen in place. Who would be camping in such a remote location? Bandits, perhaps, or drifters heading west. Or worse, maybe Blackwood had sent men to watch her family, ensuring she didn't try to run. She should leave, return home and forget this foolish midnight ride. But something about the scene below drew her forward. The fire was small and well-contained, the kind built by someone who understood the desert and respected its dangers. Whoever was down there knew what they were doing. Isabella dismounted and led Esperanza closer, moving from shadow to shadow until she could peer down into the hollow. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A man sat beside the fire, his back to her, feeding small pieces of wood to the flames. Even from this distance and angle, she could see he was tall and lean, his dark hair touching the collar of his worn leather jacket. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, grazed peacefully nearby. Something about the scene felt almost dreamlike in the silver moonlight, as if sensing her presence. The man turned. Their eyes met across 30 yards of desert, and Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening that she hadn't even known was locked. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features and eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom in the firelight. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Isabella knew she should run, should disappear back into the shadows and pretend this encounter had never happened. Instead, she found herself leading Esperanza down the gentle slope toward the fire. "Evening, miss," the stranger said as she approached. His voice was quiet and warm, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or Oklahoma. "I didn't expect company out here in the middle of nowhere." "Neither did I," Isabella replied, surprised by her own boldness. "This is usually my place." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Your place?" "Well, I reckon I'm trespassing then. My name's Thomas Ryder." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was respectful without being subservient. "Isabella Martinez," she found herself saying, though every sensible thought in her head screamed that she shouldn't be giving her real name to a stranger in the desert. Thomas gestured toward the fire. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some. Though I have to admit, I'm curious what brings a young lady out riding alone at this hour. These hills can be dangerous after dark." Isabella hesitated. Everything about this situation went against every rule she had been taught about proper behavior. But tomorrow she would be married to Harrison Blackwood, and proper behavior would be dictated by a man she despised. Tonight she was still free to make her own choices. She tied Esperanza's reins to a sturdy mesquite bush and accepted the tin cup of coffee Thomas offered. The liquid was strong and hot, warming her from the inside. She settled onto a flat rock across the fire from him, maintaining a respectful distance while still feeling the strange magnetic pull of his presence. "I could ask you the same question," she said. "What brings a cowboy to ruins in the middle of the night?" Thomas poured himself coffee and leaned back against his saddle. "Heading north to Wyoming. Got word of work on a ranch up there. But my horse threw a shoe yesterday, and the blacksmith in Copper Ridge can't see me until Monday. Figured this was as good a place as any to wait it out. Wyoming's a long way from here. Sometimes. A long way is exactly what a man needs." There was something in his tone that suggested he was running from something. Just as she was running to something, this final moment of freedom, they sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the desert night sounds, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the soft crackling of the fire. Isabella found herself studying Thomas's face in the flickering light. He had laugh lines around his eyes despite his youth, and calloused hands that spoke of hard work and long days under the sun. "What about you?" Thomas asked eventually. "What brings Isabella Martinez to the middle of nowhere on a Friday night?" The question hung in the air between them. Isabella stared into her coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. How could she explain that she was fleeing from a future that felt like a living death? How could she tell this kind stranger that tomorrow she would become the property of a man she feared and despised? "Tomorrow's my wedding day," she said finally, the words tasting like ashes. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, she found him studying her with those deep, thoughtful eyes. "Congratulations should be in order then," he said carefully. "But you don't look like a happy bride-to-be." Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Would you be happy if you were being sold like a horse at auction?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them, and suddenly she was telling him everything. About her father's debts, about Harrison Blackwood's ultimatum, about the wedding dress that had belonged to a dead woman. Thomas listened without judgment, his face growing darker as she spoke. "You don't have to go through with it," he said when she finished. "There are always choices, even when they don't seem like good ones." Easy for you to say. "You're not responsible for an entire family's survival." Thomas poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. "I had a sister once, younger than me by 3 years. Prettiest girl in all of East Texas, with a laugh that could charm birds from the trees." Isabella heard the past tense and felt her heart clench. "What happened to her?" "She married a man like your Blackwood. Rich, powerful, respected by everyone in town. Our parents thought it was the opportunity of a lifetime." His voice grew quiet and distant. "She lasted 8 months before she threw herself off a bridge rather than spend one more day as his wife." The coffee cup trembled in Isabella's hands. She set it down carefully, afraid she might drop it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "The thing is," Thomas continued, "everyone said it was her choice to marry him, that she was lucky to catch such an important man's attention. But it wasn't really a choice at all, was it? When the alternative is poverty and shame for your whole family, when everyone tells you it's your duty, your responsibility, that's not choosing. That's just a different kind of trap." Isabella stared at him across the fire, feeling seen and understood in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. This stranger, this cowboy she had met by chance in the desert, comprehended her situation better than her own parents did. "So what do you suggest?" she asked. "Should I run away and let my family face Blackwood's revenge? That I condemn them to poverty and possibly worse?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he might not answer. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the desert cold was beginning to seep through her shawl. "There might be another way," he said finally, "but it would require trust." "And courage? What do you mean?" Thomas stood and walked to his saddlebags, returning with a leather portfolio that looked official and important. He sat down closer to her, near enough that she could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. "I wasn't entirely honest about why I'm heading to Wyoming," he said. "Truth is, I work for the federal marshal's office. We've been tracking Harrison Blackwood for months, gathering evidence of his involvement in cattle rustling, land fraud, and worse." Isabella's heart began to race. "You're a lawman?" "Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Ryder," he confirmed. "And we're very close to having enough evidence to bring Blackwood down. The only problem is he's careful, keeps his hands clean while others do his dirty work. We need someone on the inside, someone who could observe his activities and gather the final pieces we need." The implications of his words hit Isabella like a physical blow. "You want me to marry him? To spy on him?" "I want you to have a choice," Thomas corrected. "You could go through with the wedding, help us gather evidence, and within a few months Blackwood would be in federal custody. Your family's debts would disappear along with him. Ill-gotten gains always do. And you would be free, Isabella's mind raced. It was dangerous, impossibly so. If Blackwood discovered what she was doing, there was no telling what he might do to her. But for the first time since her father had delivered his terrible news, she felt a spark of hope. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked. Thomas reached into his jacket and produced a silver badge, the eagle and scales of justice gleaming in the firelight. Then he handed her an official document bearing the seal of the Federal Marshal's office. "More importantly," he said, "how do I know I can trust you?" Isabella looked up from the documents to find him watching her intently. In his eyes, she saw not the cold calculation she had expected, but genuine concern and something else, something that made her pulse quicken. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "what happens to me when it's over? After Blackwood is arrested, what becomes of Isabella Martinez?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "That would be up to you. You could go anywhere, be anyone you wanted to be. The federal government pays well for services like this." The fire had died down to embers now, and the desert cold was settling around them like a blanket. Isabella pulled her shawl tighter and considered the impossible choice before her. Marry Harrison Blackwood as a helpless victim, or marry him as an agent of justice. Either way, she would be walking into danger, but at least this path offered hope. "How would we communicate?" she asked. "If I'm living in his house, under his control, how would I get information to you?" Thomas smiled for the first time that night, and Isabella felt her heart skip. "Leave that to me. I'm very good at staying invisible when I need to be." As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Isabella made her decision. It was still dangerous, still terrifying, but it was the first real choice she had been offered in days. "All right, Marshal Ryder," she said. "I'll do it." Dawn painted the desert in shades of rose and gold as Isabella rode Esperanza back toward the ranch. Her mind buzzed with everything Thomas had told her, the weight of her new mission both terrifying and exhilarating. She was no longer just a victim being bartered away. She was an agent of justice, carrying federal authority in her heart, even if she couldn't show it. The ranch house came into view just as the sun crested the mountains. Isabella quickly unsaddled Esperanza and slipped back into the house, her boots silent on the wooden floors. She had barely pulled off her riding clothes when she heard her mother moving about in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for what everyone believed would be Isabella's wedding day. "Mija?" Elena called softly. "Are you awake?" "Yes, Mama," Isabella replied, pulling on her nightgown and climbing back into bed just as her mother appeared in the doorway. Elena's eyes were swollen from crying, but she managed a tremulous smile. "I thought we might spend some time together this morning, before—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Isabella's heart ached as she looked at her mother's grief-stricken face. Elena had no idea that her daughter now carried hope instead of despair, that this wedding might be the key to their family's true salvation rather than their destruction. "I'd like that." "Mama, they spent the morning in the kitchen." Elena teaching Isabella recipes she claimed every married woman should know. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that her mother was preparing her to cook for the very man they were planning to help destroy. But she listened attentively, memorizing every detail, knowing that her performance as Harrison Blackwood's wife would need to be flawless. "The secret to good mole is patience," Elena said, grinding chilies with practice motions. "You cannot rush the flavors. They must marry slowly over time." Carlos burst into the kitchen around noon, his hair still tousled from sleep. "Is it time for the wedding yet? Can I wear Papa's good boots?" Elena smoothed her son's hair with floury hands. "Not yet, Mijo. But yes, you may wear Papa's boots if they fit." Vicente appeared in the doorway, dressed in his finest suit, a black wool jacket that had been his father's. He looked older than his 43 years, the weight of his decision etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "The priest is here," he announced quietly. "Father Miguel wants to speak with you before the ceremony, Isabella." Father Miguel was waiting in the parlor, his kind face troubled. He had baptized Isabella, heard her first confession, watched her grow from a curious child into a thoughtful young woman. Now he was being asked to marry her to a man everyone knew would make her miserable. "My child," he said gently, taking her hands in his weathered ones. "Are you certain this is what you want?" Isabella met his eyes steadily. "It's what needs to happen, Father." He studied her face for a long moment, clearly surprised by her composure. "You seem different today, calmer than I expected." "Perhaps I've made peace with my fate," Isabella said, "and it wasn't entirely a lie." Father Miguel nodded slowly. "Marriage is a sacred bond, Isabella. Even when the circumstances are difficult, promise me you'll remember that whatever happens, God sees your heart. Your true feelings, your real intentions, these matter more than what the world sees." His words carried a weight that made Isabella wonder if he somehow suspected there was more to this situation than met the eye. "I promise, Father." The afternoon brought a parade of visitors. Harrison Blackwood's household staff arrived first. His housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, a stern-faced woman in her 60s who looked Isabella up and down with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Blackwood expects his wife to maintain certain standards," Mrs. Whitmore announced without preamble. "You'll need to learn proper etiquette, household management, and social graces suitable for a woman of his position." Isabella nodded meekly, playing the role of the intimidated bride-to-be. Inside, she was memorizing every detail about Blackwood's household structure. The people who worked for him, the routines and expectations that would govern her new life. Next came Blackwood's seamstress, a nervous woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who had been tasked with altering Sarah Blackwood's wedding dress to fit Isabella. The woman's hands shook as she pinned and tucked the silk, clearly uncomfortable with the morbid nature of her assignment. "It's a beautiful dress," Mrs. Hartwell said, trying to fill the awkward silence. Mrs. Sarah she was a lovely woman. Very gentle. Isabella caught something in the seamstress's tone, a sadness that went deeper than general sympathy. "Did you know her well?" Mrs. Hartwell's hands stilled for a moment. "I made many dresses for her over the years. I watched her grow thinner with each fitting. By the end," she shook her head and resumed her work without finishing the sentence. "Another piece of the puzzle. Sarah Blackwood had grown thin, whether from illness, unhappiness, or something more sinister. Isabella would soon find out. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Isabella found herself alone in her room with the altered wedding dress. The silk was beautiful, she had to admit, with intricate beadwork that caught the light like captured stars. But wearing a dead woman's dress to marry her widower felt like participating in her own haunting. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Isabella?" It was Carlos, peeking around the doorframe. "Can I come in?" She opened the door to find her little brother dressed in their father's oversized boots and his own best shirt, his hair slicked down with water. He looked so young, so innocent of the dark currents swirling around their family. "You look very handsome," Isabella said, kneeling to his height. Carlos beamed, then his expression grew serious. "Isabella, are you going to be happy?" The question caught her off guard. While the adults had focused on duty and necessity, her 15-year-old brother was the only one to ask about her happiness. "I'm going to try to be," she said honestly. "And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you and Mama and Papa are safe and happy too." Carlos threw his arms around her neck. "I'll miss you." "I'm not going far," Isabella whispered into his hair. "And this isn't goodbye forever." As evening approached, carriages began arriving for the ceremony. Copper Ridge's leading citizens came dressed in their finest clothes, drawn by curiosity more than affection. Everyone wanted to witness Harrison Blackwood's third wedding, to see how this one would differ from the others. Isabella watched from her bedroom window as the guests gathered in their front yard. Lanterns had been strung between the trees, casting warm light over the scene. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Then she saw him. Harrison Blackwood stepped down from his black carriage, resplendent in a dark suit that probably cost more than her family's ranch. Even from a distance, his presence commanded attention. People stepped aside to let him pass, their deference clear in every gesture. "Isabella," Elena called from the hallway. "It's time." With hands that barely trembled, Isabella put on Sarah Blackwood's wedding dress. The silk whispered against her skin, like secrets waiting to be told. She arranged her dark hair in a simple style, allowing it to fall loose over her shoulders as Thomas had seen it the night before. Something about maintaining that connection to her real self, to the woman who had made a choice rather than simply accepting her fate, gave her strength. The ceremony took place in the Martinez family's small courtyard, under the same stars that had witnessed her meeting with Thomas Ryder. Father Miguel's voice carried clearly in the desert air as he spoke of duty, honor, and the sacred bonds of matrimony. Isabella stood beside Harrison Blackwood, acutely aware of his imposing presence, the way his cold blue eyes never seemed to blink. When he took her hand for the ring ceremony, his grip was firm to the point of pain, a subtle reminder of the power dynamics at play. Do you, Isabella Maria Martinez, take Harrison James Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband, to honor and obey him in all things, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health? Till death do you part? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella looked out at the assembled crowd, at her weeping mother, her guilty father, her confused brother. Then her eyes found a figure, standing in the shadows, beyond the lantern light, Thomas Ryder watching from the darkness. His presence a reminder that she wasn't alone in this deception. I do, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard. When Blackwood kissed her to seal their union, his lips were cold and possessive. The crowd applauded politely, but Isabella could hear the underlying discomfort in the sound. Everyone knew this wasn't a love match, but no one was willing to say so aloud. The reception was a stilted affair. Blackwood's wealth had provided tables laden with expensive foods and fine wines, but the atmosphere remained funeral-like. Isabella played her part perfectly, the nervous young bride, overwhelmed by her new circumstances, but trying to be gracious. You did well tonight, Blackwood murmured in her ear as they prepared to leave for his estate. I trust you'll continue to be so compliant. The threat in his words was unmistakable, but Isabella simply nodded demurely. Of course, husband. The ride to Blackwood's mansion took 20 minutes through winding desert roads. Isabella had seen the house from a distance many times, a sprawling adobe structure built on a hill overlooking the valley. Up close it was even more impressive and intimidating. Iron gates guarded the entrance, and armed men patrolled the grounds. Mrs. Whitmore greeted them at the front door, her expression as welcoming as winter frost. Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood. I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction. The interior was opulent beyond anything Isabella had ever experienced. Thick carpets covered polished floors, oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, and crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across every surface. It was beautiful and cold, like living inside a museum. Your things have been placed in the mistress's suite, Mrs. Whitmore continued, leading them up a grand staircase. Mr. Blackwood thought you might want time to adjust to your new surroundings before sharing his quarters. Isabella felt a wave of relief that she hoped didn't show on her face. She had dreaded this moment most of all. But apparently, even Harrison Blackwood possessed enough consideration to give his child bride a brief reprieve. The mistress's suite was larger than the entire Martinez house. A massive four-poster bed dominated the room, draped in blue silk that matched the curtains. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the estate's gardens. This was Mrs. Sarah's room, Mrs. Whitmore said, watching Isabella's face carefully. Mr. Blackwood had it redecorated for you. But if there's anything you'd like changed, Isabella walked to the vanity table, where silver brushes and crystal perfume bottles were arranged with military precision. In the mirror above, she caught sight of a portrait hanging on the opposite wall, a young woman with gentle eyes and a sad smile, wearing a blue dress that matched the room's decor. That's Sarah, Mrs. Whitmore said softly. Mr. Blackwood wanted her portrait to remain. He said it might provide guidance for his new wife. The housekeeper's tone suggested she found this arrangement as disturbing as Isabella did, but neither woman dared voice such thoughts aloud. After Mrs. Whitmore left, Isabella explored her new prison. The room was beautiful but felt haunted, as if Sarah Blackwood's unhappiness had soaked into the very walls. Isabella found herself talking to the portrait, promising the dead woman that her suffering wouldn't be in vain. A soft tap at the balcony doors made Isabella's heart leap. She pulled back the curtains to find a figure in dark clothes standing in the shadows of the garden below. Thomas Ryder touched the brim of his hat and melted back into the darkness. But his message was clear. He was watching. He was nearby. And she wasn't alone. Isabella changed into the nightgown that had been laid out for her, another garment that had probably belonged to Sarah, and climbed into the enormous bed. The sheets were silk and smelled of lavender, but they felt cold against her skin. As she lay staring at the ceiling, Isabella reflected on the day's events. She was now Mrs. Harrison Blackwood, mistress of one of the territory's largest estates, with servants to attend to her every need. To the outside world, she had achieved a remarkable elevation in status, but she knew the truth. She was a federal agent deep undercover, married to a criminal, surrounded by potential enemies, with only a mysterious cowboy marshal as her lifeline to safety. The real work was just beginning, and everything depended on her ability to play her role perfectly while gathering the evidence that would destroy the man sleeping just down the hall. The irony wasn't lost on her that in accepting what appeared to be the ultimate surrender of her freedom, she had actually claimed more power than she'd ever possessed. Harrison Blackwood thought he owned her, but in reality, she was the hunter and he was the prey. Tomorrow, her new life would begin in earnest. Tonight, she allowed herself one last moment to grieve for Isabella Martinez, the rancher's daughter who had died at sunset and been reborn as something far more dangerous. Isabella woke to unfamiliar sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, boots on wooden floors below, and voices she didn't recognize. Sunlight streamed through the heavy curtains of her new bedroom, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the weight of her situation crashed back down on her like a landslide. She was Mrs. Harrison Blackwood now, the wife of the most powerful and dangerous man in 3 counties. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am?" came a young voice through the door. "Mrs. Whitmore sent me to help you dress." Isabella opened the door to find a girl who couldn't have been much older than herself, with auburn hair and freckles across her nose. She held a breakfast tray and wore the simple black dress of a house servant. "I'm Molly, ma'am, your lady's maid." Isabella had never had a lady's maid in her life, but she stepped aside to let the girl enter. "Thank you, Molly, and please just call me Isabella when we're alone." Molly's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, I couldn't, ma'am. Mrs. Whitmore would have my hide. Mr. Blackwood expects proper protocol from all his staff." The girl's nervous energy spoke volumes about the atmosphere in this house. Isabella made a mental note. Fear ruled here, and that fear might be useful if she could gain the servant's trust. As Molly helped her into a burgundy dress that had been selected from the new wardrobe Blackwood had provided, Isabella began her intelligence gathering. "Have you worked here long, Molly?" 3 years, ma'am. I started when I was 16. Molly's hands were gentle but efficient as she arranged Isabella's hair. Mrs. Sarah was still alive then. She was always kind to us staff. What was she like? Molly's reflection in the mirror grew troubled. "Beautiful, ma'am, and gentle." But she got sadder as time went on, especially after... The girl caught herself and pressed her lips together. "After what?" "I shouldn't say, ma'am. It's not my place." Isabella turned to face the young woman directly. "Molly, I'm going to be living in this house for a long time. If there are things I should know, things that might help me understand my new life here, I'd appreciate your honesty." Molly glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "After she lost the baby, ma'am, Mrs. Sarah was with the child twice during my time here." "Both times?" "Well, the doctor said it was natural causes, but Mrs. Sarah blamed herself. Said she wasn't strong enough to give Mr. Blackwood the son he wanted." Isabella's blood chilled. Miscarriages could be natural, certainly. But in the context of what Thomas had told her about his sister, about the pattern of Blackwood's wives, It took on a more sinister cast. Where is Mrs. Sarah buried? In the family cemetery, just beyond the rose garden. Mr. Blackwood visits her grave every Sunday after church. Molly's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Sometimes I hear him talking to her, making promises about how the next wife will be different. The breakfast tray contained eggs, fresh bread, and coffee that was far superior to anything Isabella had tasted at home. As she ate, she wondered if Blackwood was testing her, watching to see if she would adapt to luxury or remain stubbornly humble. She decided to show appreciation without seeming overwhelmed. "Please tell Mrs. Whitmore the breakfast was excellent," she told Molly. "I'd like to meet with her this morning to discuss household matters." Mrs. Whitmore appeared within the hour. Her grey hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her features. She carried herself like a general preparing for battle. "I trust you slept well, Mrs. Blackwood." "Very well, thank you. I'd like to understand my role here and what's expected of me." The housekeeper's expression softened marginally, as if Isabella had passed some invisible test. "Mr. Blackwood expects his wife to be a gracious hostess, to manage the household staff efficiently, and to represent his interests in the community. He entertains frequently business associates, political figures, and other ranchers." Perfect. Social gatherings meant opportunities to observe, to listen, to gather the evidence Thomas needed. "I'll need to learn about his associates, his preferences for entertaining, his business interests," Isabella said. "I want to be the wife he deserves." Something flickered in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes, surprise perhaps, or approval. Mrs. Sarah found it challenging, adjusting to the social demands. "But you seem more determined." "Mrs. Sarah was clearly a gentler soul than I am," Isabella replied carefully. "I hope to honor her memory while finding my own way." Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly. "There's a dinner party planned for Thursday evening. Several cattle ranchers from neighboring counties, plus Mr. Pemberton, the lawyer, and Sheriff Morrison. It would be an excellent opportunity for you to meet the important men in your husband's circle." Isabella filed away every name. A dinner party meant conversations, documents possibly left unattended, opportunities to establish relationships that might prove useful later. The rest of the morning was spent touring the house with Mrs. Whitmore as her guide. The mansion was even larger than it had appeared the night before, 23 rooms in total, including Blackwood's private study, a library, a formal dining room that could seat 30 people, and servants' quarters that housed 12 full-time staff members. In the library, Isabella discovered something that made her pulse quicken. Among the leather-bound volumes and first editions was a section dedicated to legal documents, property deeds, and business correspondence. If evidence of Blackwood's crimes existed in this house, it would likely be found here. "Mr. Blackwood conducts much of his business from home," Mrs. Whitmore explained. "The study is his private domain. No one enters without his express permission." Another mental note. The study would be her primary target, but she would need to be extremely careful about when and how she approached it. They were interrupted by the sound of horses in the courtyard. Through the library windows, Isabella watched Harrison Blackwood ride up with 3 other men, all mounted on expensive horses and wearing the clothes of successful ranchers. Her husband dismounted with fluid grace despite his age, his commanding presence evident even at a distance. "Mr. Blackwood has returned from his morning ride," Mrs. Whitmore observed. "He'll expect you to greet him." Isabella made her way to the front entrance, her heart hammering despite her outward composure. This would be her first real test, playing the dutiful wife in front of witnesses. Blackwood strode through the door with his companions behind him. In daylight, he was even more intimidating than he had been at their wedding. His steel-grey hair was perfectly groomed, his moustache waxed to sharp points, and his eyes held the calculating intelligence of a man who had built an empire through ruthless determination. "Isabella," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Come and meet some of my business associates." She approached with what she hoped looked like appropriate deference. "Good morning, husband," Blackwood's hand settled on her lower back, possessive and controlling. "Gentlemen, my wife, Isabella. Isabella, this is Daniel Crawford from the Triple Creek Ranch. Marcus Webb, who owns the largest spread in Pima County. And Judge Theodore Hawkins." Isabella curtsied gracefully to each man, noting the way they looked at her, some with appreciation, others with the calculating assessment of men evaluating a business asset. Judge Hawkins, in particular, studied her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood," the judge said. "I hope you'll find married life agreeable." "I'm sure I will, Your Honor. My husband has been the most generous." Crawford, a man in his 40s with sun-weathered skin, spoke up. "Blackwood, you've done well for yourself. She's a considerable improvement over—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence. "Over my previous wives?" Blackwood's tone was dangerously quiet. "I believe Isabella will prove more durable than her predecessors." The word durable sent ice through Isabella's veins. It wasn't a term one typically used to describe a wife, unless durability was in question. "We have business to discuss," Blackwood announced. "Isabella, see that refreshments are prepared for my guests. Will be in my study." As the men disappeared into the forbidden room, Isabella caught fragments of their conversation, mentions of cattle counts that didn't match official records, discussions of problem homesteaders, and references to someone called the buyer in El Paso. Every word was potentially valuable intelligence. She spent the afternoon establishing routines that would give her access to information. Under the guise of being a conscientious hostess, she made excuses to walk past Blackwood's study, noting when the door was left open, when voices were raised, when documents were spread across his desk. Around 4 o'clock, she discovered something remarkable. The study had a ventilation grate near the floor that connected to the basement storage room directly below. If she could find a reason to visit the basement regularly, she might be able to overhear conversations without being detected. That evening, Blackwood joined her for dinner in the formal dining room. The massive table, designed to seat 30, made them seem isolated at opposite ends. Crystal glasses and silver cutlery reflected the candlelight, creating an atmosphere that was elegant and cold. "How did you spend your day?" Blackwood asked, cutting his steak with precise motions. "Getting acquainted with the house and staff. Mrs. Whitmore has been very helpful. I understand there's a dinner party planned for Thursday?" "Indeed. Important men, Isabella. Men whose opinions matter in this territory. I expect you to make a favorable impression." "Of course. What sort of business brings them together?" Blackwood's eyes sharpened slightly. "Cattle business. Land management. The sorts of concerns that needn't trouble your pretty head." Isabella smiled demurely. "I'm sure you're right. Though I confess, growing up on a ranch, I've always found such matters interesting. This isn't your father's small operation, my dear. The scale of my enterprises is far beyond anything you've encountered." His tone carried a warning. "You'll find life more pleasant if you focus on domestic concerns, household management, social obligations, and preparing to bear my children." The casual mention of children made Isabella's skin crawl, but she maintained her composure. "I understand, husband." After dinner, Blackwood retired to his study with brandy and cigars. Isabella used the opportunity to explore the basement storage room, ostensibly looking for additional linens. The space was larger than expected, filled with crates and barrels that bore markings from various railroad companies. More importantly, she discovered that voices from the study above carried clearly through the ventilation system. If she positioned herself correctly among the stored goods, she could listen to Blackwood's private conversations without detection, as if summoned by her discovery. She heard footsteps above and the sound of the study door opening. A visitor had arrived, someone Blackwood greeted with familiarity rather than formality. "Any word from our friends in Mexico?" Blackwood's voice filtered down through the grate. "The shipment is delayed," came the reply in accented English. "Border Patrol has increased activity near Nogales." Isabella's pulse quickened. This sounded like smuggling, possibly cattle rustling across the Mexican border, exactly the kind of federal crime Thomas had mentioned. How long? 2 weeks, perhaps 3. Our contact says the heat will die down after the elections. Unacceptable. We have buyers waiting in Denver. If we can't deliver on schedule, they'll find other suppliers. Isabella memorized every word, every detail. This was the evidence Thomas needed, but she had to be careful about how she recorded and transmitted it. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering routes, payoffs to corrupt officials, and plans to eliminate problematic homesteaders whose claims interfered with cattle movement. By the time the visitor left, Isabella had enough information to begin building a federal case. She waited a full hour before creeping back upstairs, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. Harrison Blackwood wasn't just involved in cattle rustling. He was running a sophisticated criminal organization that spanned multiple territories and crossed international borders. Back in her room, Isabella found Molly waiting with a nightgown and warm milk. The young maid's presence reminded her that she wasn't the only one at risk in this house. If her mission was discovered, everyone who had helped her, knowingly or not, would face Blackwood's wrath. "Molly," she said carefully, as the girl helped her prepare for bed, "if you ever see or hear anything that troubles you, anything that doesn't seem right, will you tell me?" Molly's hands stilled in the process of braiding Isabella's hair. "Ma'am, I know this house has seen sadness. I don't want to repeat Mrs. Sarah's mistakes." The young woman met Isabella's eyes in the mirror. "There are things that happen here that aren't talked about. Staff members who ask too many questions sometimes find themselves dismissed without references. Makes it hard to find work elsewhere. But you feel safe?" "As safe as anyone can feel working for Mr. Blackwood," Molly replied diplomatically. After the maid left, Isabella sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection, while her mind worked through the challenges ahead. She had valuable intelligence, but no way to contact Thomas safely. She was surrounded by potential allies among the staff, but couldn't be certain who could be trusted. Most critically, she had to maintain her performance as the dutiful wife while gathering evidence that could get her killed if discovered. The portrait of Sarah Blackwood seemed to watch her from across the room, a constant reminder of what happened to women who crossed Harrison Blackwood. But unlike Sarah, Isabella wasn't facing her husband alone. Somewhere in the darkness outside, Thomas Ryder was watching, waiting, ready to help her bring justice to this house of shadows. She just had to stay alive long enough to gather the proof they needed. 3 days into her new life, Isabella had settled into a careful routine. Morning rides through the estate gave her opportunities to survey the property and note security patterns. Afternoons were spent managing household affairs, which provided cover for her real work, mapping out Blackwood's operation and identifying key players in his organization. She had discovered that Blackwood employed over 40 men across his various enterprises. Some were legitimate ranch hands, but others had the hard eyes and careful movements of men comfortable with violence. They deferred to a man called Jennings, Blackwood's foreman, who carried himself like a military commander and wore a Colt 45. With the easy familiarity of someone who used it regularly, Isabella was sketching the property layout in her mind during her morning ride when she spotted a figure on horseback in the distance, silhouetted against the sunrise on a ridge overlooking the estate. The rider sat motionless for several minutes before disappearing over the crest. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a random traveler, but Isabella's pulse quickened with recognition. Thomas was maintaining surveillance, just as he had promised. That afternoon brought the first real test of her undercover skills. Sheriff Morrison arrived unannounced, his badge glinting in the desert sun as he dismounted from his horse. Isabella watched from the library window as Blackwood emerged from the stables to greet him, their conversation too distant to overhear, but clearly animated. "Mrs. Blackwood." Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Blackwood requests your presence in the parlor." Isabella's stomach tightened, but she maintained her composure as she made her way downstairs. Sheriff Morrison was a man in his 50s, with a beer gut and tobacco-stained teeth, the kind of lawman who had grown comfortable with selective enforcement of justice.
"Isabella, my dear," Blackwood said as she entered, his arms sliding around her waist with possessive familiarity. "Sheriff Morrison has some concerns about recent cattle losses in the area." Morrison tipped his hat. "Ma'am, just wanted to let your husband know we've had reports of rustling near the Mexican border. Lost 100 heads from the Johnson spread last week." "Terrible business," Isabella replied sympathetically. "I hope you catch the thieves." "Oh, we will," Morrison said with confidence that seemed forced. "Your husband's been mighty helpful with information about strangers in the area. Always keeps his eyes open for suspicious activity." Blackwood's smile was cold as winter steel. "I have a vested interest in maintaining order, Sheriff. Rustlers cost us all money." The irony wasn't lost on Isabella Blackwood, positioning himself as a victim of the very crimes he was orchestrating. She filed away every detail of the conversation, noting the easy familiarity between the two men and Morrison's obvious reluctance to ask probing questions. After the sheriff left, Blackwood's demeanor changed completely. The genial host disappeared, replaced by a man whose eyes held deadly calculations. "Walk with me, Isabella." It wasn't a request. They strolled through the rose garden where Sarah Blackwood was buried, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. Isabella could see the modest headstone marking the grave, adorned with fresh flowers that someone, possibly Blackwood himself, had recently placed there. "Marriage requires complete honesty between husband and wife," Blackwood said, his voice deceptively casual. "I trust you understand that any divided loyalties would be most unfortunate." "I don't understand what you mean." He stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Your family's debts didn't simply disappear when we married, my dear. I hold the notes now, which means I hold their futures in my hands. Their continued prosperity depends entirely on your cooperation." The threat was crystal clear. Isabella felt ice form in her veins, but forced herself to maintain eye contact. "You needn't worry about my loyalty, husband. My family means everything to me." "Excellent." His smile returned, but it never reached his eyes. "I knew you were an intelligent woman the moment I saw you." Intelligence, properly channeled, can be a wife's greatest asset. That evening, Isabella excused herself early, claiming fatigue. In reality, she needed time to process what she had learned and figure out how to make contact with Thomas. The basement listening post had yielded more intelligence over the past few days, references to the El Paso connection, mentions of bribes paid to border officials, and discussions of problem homesteaders who needed to be relocated. She had the information Thomas needed, but no way to safely transmit it. The solution came from an unexpected source. Around midnight, as Isabella sat at her vanity brushing her hair, she heard a soft tapping at her balcony doors. Her heart leaped, but she forced herself to move slowly, cautiously. Thomas stood in the shadows of the garden below, barely visible in the moonlight. He gestured toward the rose garden, then melted back into the darkness. Isabella waited 20 minutes before slipping out of the house. She had memorized the patrol schedules of Blackwood's guards and knew she had a narrow window of opportunity. The rose garden was peaceful in the moonlight, Sarah's grave a pale rectangle among the dark bushes. "You came," Thomas's voice whispered from behind a marble bench. Isabella turned to find him emerging from the shadows like a ghost. In his dark clothes, he was nearly invisible, but his presence filled her with relief she hadn't expected to feel. "I have information," she whispered urgently. "Cattle rustling, cross-border smuggling, corruption." "Slow down," Thomas said gently, moving closer. "Start from the beginning." For the next 10 minutes, Isabella recounted everything she had overheard and observed. Thomas listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. His proximity in the moonlight made her acutely aware of how isolated and dangerous her position had become. "This is excellent work," he said when she finished. "Better than we had hoped for so quickly. There's more. He's threatening my family, using their safety to ensure my cooperation. And Sheriff Morrison is clearly corrupt. He and Blackwood are working together." Thomas's expression darkened. "We suspected as much about Morrison. As for your family, I have men watching your father's ranch. They're safe." Relief flooded through Isabella. "How many more federal agents are involved?" "Just me in the immediate area. But I have backup I can call if needed." Thomas reached into his jacket and produced a small leather pouch. "Emergency signals. If you're in immediate danger, light a candle in your bedroom window and leave it burning. If you have urgent intelligence, place a white cloth on your balcony railing."
Isabella took the pouch, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected shock through her system. "How long do you think this will take?" she asked. "A few more weeks, maybe less if you can access his private papers. We need documented evidence of the criminal enterprise, financial records, correspondence with his Mexican contacts, proof of the bribes to officials. His study is locked when he's not there, and he never leaves it unattended during the day. What about at night?" Isabella considered this. "He sometimes works late, but he drinks brandy while he does it. If I could find a way to enhance his drinking, he might become careless." Thomas studied her face in the moonlight. "That's dangerous, Isabella. If he suspects you're drugging him—" "I'm not talking about drugs. Just being a particularly attentive wife, ensuring his glass stays full." Isabella's mind was already working through the logistics. "Tomorrow is the dinner party. Important men, lots of drinking, conversation that might reveal more about the operation. Be careful. These aren't just rustlers. They're involved in human trafficking, smuggling weapons, probably murder. If Blackwood realizes what you're doing—" Isabella thought of Sarah Blackwood's grave, of the fear in Molly's eyes, of her own family's safety hanging by a thread. "He won't realize it. I'm learning to be exactly the wife he expects me to be." Thomas reached out and touched her hand briefly. "I know this is asking too much of you. When this is over, you'll have your freedom and enough money to go anywhere, be anyone you want to be. And what about you?" The question slipped out before Isabella could stop it. "Me?" Thomas seemed surprised by the question. "When this is over, where will you go?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "I haven't thought much beyond completing this mission." The air between them crackled with unspoken possibility, but both knew this wasn't the time or place for such conversations. Isabella was married, regardless of the circumstances, and Thomas was a federal agent with a job to complete. "I should get back," Isabella whispered reluctantly. "Isabella." Thomas caught her arm gently as she started to turn away. "What you're doing?" "It takes incredible courage. I want you to know that." Their eyes met in the moonlight, and Isabella felt something shift between them, a recognition of partnership that went beyond professional necessity. For the first time since this nightmare began, she didn't feel alone. "Just stay safe," she whispered. "I need to know you're out there." The next morning brought frantic preparation for the evening's dinner party. Isabella threw herself into the role of gracious hostess, working with Mrs. Whitmore to plan a menu that would impress Blackwood's guests while encouraging them to drink freely. Mr. Blackwood particularly enjoys his imported whiskey after dinner, Mrs. Whitmore noted as they reviewed the evening schedule. "Perhaps we should ensure the decanters are especially well stocked," Isabella smiled. "An excellent idea. We want our guests to feel thoroughly welcomed." Throughout the day, she observed the additional security measures being put in place. Extra guards were posted around the property, and she noticed several men she didn't recognize among the staff, hard-faced individuals who were clearly armed despite their servants' attire. The guests began arriving at sunset. Judge Hawkins, the cattle ranchers Crawford and Webb, Sheriff Morrison, Lawyer Pemberton, and 3 men Isabella hadn't met before. All were wealthy, powerful figures in the territory's political and economic hierarchy. Isabella had dressed carefully for the occasion in a deep green silk gown that projected both elegance and appropriate deference. She played her role perfectly, charming without being forward, intelligent without being threatening, beautiful without being distracting from the men's business. Dinner conversations centered around territorial politics, upcoming elections, and the challenges of managing large cattle operations in an increasingly lawless region. Isabella listened carefully, noting the subtle references to problem homesteaders, difficult federal investigators, and the need for creative solutions to regulatory challenges. The key, Judge Hawkins was saying as the brandy was served, is ensuring that territorial law remains flexible enough to address local realities. Exactly, agreed one of the men Isabella hadn't met. A thin, nervous individual introduced as Mr. Dalton. Federal intervention is the real threat. Too many Washington bureaucrats trying to impose Eastern values on Western territories. Blackwood nodded gravely. Which is why men like us must stick together. Mutual support, shared interests, common goals. Isabella kept the drinks flowing and the conversation light on the surface while her mind catalogued every name, every reference, every hint about the scope of their criminal organization. By evening's end, she had identified at least 8 men complicit in Blackwood's operations, including 2 territorial officials she hadn't previously suspected. After the guest departed, Blackwood was in an expansive mood, the successful evening and liberal amounts of whiskey having relaxed his usual rigid control. "You did well tonight, my dear," he said, settling into his leather chair with a final brandy. "My associates were quite impressed. I'm glad I could be helpful." Isabella moved to massage his shoulders, a gesture that put her close enough to see the papers scattered across his desk. "They seem like fascinating men with such interesting businesses. Indeed they are, men of vision, willing to take the necessary steps to build this territory's future." His words were slightly slurred now. The whiskey finally taking full effect, Isabella continued her massage while scanning the documents within her view. She could see correspondence with Mexican contacts, financial ledgers with suspicious entries, and what appeared to be a map marking routes across the border. "You must be tired, husband," she murmured. "Perhaps you should retire for the evening." Blackwood nodded slowly, the combination of alcohol, successful business, and his wife's attention making him more amenable than usual. "Perhaps you're right. But first—" He turned in his chair and pulled Isabella onto his lap, his hands roaming in ways that made her skin crawl. Isabella forced herself not to recoil, knowing that her performance now could determine whether she lived or died. She endured his pawing for several agonizing minutes before he finally released her. "Tomorrow night, my dear," he said with a predatory smile. "I think it's time we properly consummated our union." Isabella's blood turned to ice, but she managed a demure nod. "Of course, husband." As Blackwood stumbled off to his bedroom, Isabella remained in the study, her heart pounding with both terror and opportunity. She had perhaps 15 minutes before he might notice her absence, and the desk, full of evidence, was finally within her reach. Isabella's hands trembled as she approached Blackwood's mahogany desk. The study felt cavernous in the lamplight, shadows dancing across leather-bound books and mounted hunting trophies that seemed to watch her every movement. From down the hall came the sound of Blackwood's heavy footsteps and slamming doors as he prepared for bed. She had minutes, maybe less. The first document she examined made her stomach lurch, a detailed ledger recording cattle transactions that were clearly fraudulent. Hundreds of heads purchased from Mexican contacts at prices far below market value, then sold to buyers in Colorado and Denver at substantial profits. The dates corresponded perfectly with the rustling reports she had heard. "About from Sheriff Morrison." Isabella quickly photographed the pages with the small camera Thomas had given her during their garden meeting, her fingers working as quietly as possible. Each click of the shutter sounded deafeningly loud in the silent house. The second folder contained correspondence that was even more damning. Letters from someone signed only as El Lobo detailed smuggling routes, bribe amounts for border officials, and schedules for moving merchandise across the territorial boundaries. The merchandise wasn't just cattle. References to the Chicago buyers and special cargo suggested human trafficking on a scale that made Isabella's blood run cold. A letter dated just 3 days ago caught her attention. HB, the senator's visit proceeds as planned. Ensure your wife makes a proper impression. Future territorial appointments depend on Washington's perception of stability. Our mutual friend in El Paso confirms shipment is ready for Saturday delivery. Double payment as discussed. E.L. Isabella photographed everything, her mind racing to decode the implications. A senator was coming to visit. Territorial appointments were being influenced by criminal enterprises. And something significant was happening on Saturday. Just 2 days away, heavy footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. Blackwood was coming back. Isabella quickly returned the documents to their original positions and moved to the bookshelf, pulling down a volume of Shakespeare as if she had been browsing for reading material. When Blackwood appeared in the doorway, swaying slightly from the whiskey, she looked up with innocent surprise. "Oh, I was looking for something to help me sleep. I hope you don't mind." "Not at all, my dear." His voice was thick with alcohol and something else that made Isabella's skin crawl. "Though I can think of better remedies for sleeplessness than books." He moved toward her with predatory intent. But Isabella sidestepped gracefully, holding up the Shakespeare volume like a shield. "This was always my favorite," she said quickly. "Romeo and Juliet. So tragic, yet so beautiful." Blackwood paused, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process the literary reference. Tragic indeed. Young lovers destroyed by family conflict. His cold eyes focused on her with disturbing intensity. "But we have no such obstacles, do we, Isabella? No feuding families to keep us apart, no husband. No obstacles at all." The lie tasted like poison, but it seemed to satisfy him. Blackwood nodded and turned back toward the door. "Tomorrow evening, then?" he said, his tone making the words sound like a threat rather than a promise. "After I return from my business in town." Isabella waited until his footsteps faded completely before allowing herself to breathe. She had the evidence Thomas needed, but the personal cost was becoming unbearable. Tomorrow night, she would have to submit to Blackwood's advances or risk exposure that could destroy not only her mission, but her family's safety. Back in her room, she found Molly waiting with a cup of chamomile tea. "You look pale." "Ma'am," the young woman said with concern, "are you feeling well?" "Just tired." It was a long evening. Isabella accepted the tea gratefully, using the warmth to steady her shaking hands. "Molly, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course, ma'am. How did Mrs. Sarah? How did she manage? The loneliness, the pressure being married to such a demanding man?" Molly's expression grew troubled. "She didn't manage it well, ma'am. Toward the end, she barely ate, barely slept. Used to stand on her balcony for hours, staring out at the desert like she was looking for something that never came." "What do you think she was looking for?" "Freedom, I suppose. A way out." Molly's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The night she died, she asked me to deliver a letter to town. Said it was important, that someone was waiting for it. But when I came back the next morning," Isabella's pulse quickened. "What happened to the letter?" "Mr. Blackwood burned it. I saw him throwing the pieces into the fireplace." Whatever Mrs. Sarah was trying to say, whoever she was trying to reach, he made sure the message never got delivered. This revelation added a new dimension to Sarah's death. She hadn't simply succumbed to despair. She had been trying to communicate with someone, possibly seeking help or exposing her husband's crimes. Blackwood had silenced her permanently. After Molly left, Isabella placed a white cloth on her balcony railing, the signal for urgent intelligence. She could only hope Thomas would see it and arrange another meeting. The evidence she had gathered was explosive, but the timeline was accelerating faster than they had anticipated. The next morning brought disturbing news from an unexpected source. Isabella was supervising the weekly marketing trip to town when she overheard two ranch hands discussing a tragedy that had occurred the previous night. "Found him at the bottom of Canyon Creek," one was saying. "The horse came back without him around midnight. Who? Isabella asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Miguel Fernandez, the blacksmith's son, the ranch hand replied. Terrible accident. Must have lost his footing in the dark. Isabella's blood turned to ice. Miguel, the gentle young man who had been courting her before her marriage, who had made no secret of his disapproval when the engagement to Blackwood was announced. This was no accident. She excused herself and drove the buggy to town under the pretense of selecting fabrics for new curtains. In reality, she needed to learn more about Miguel's death and possibly make contact with Thomas. The blacksmith shop was closed, draped in black crepe. Miguel's father, Don Roberto, sat outside, aged a decade overnight by grief. Senora Blackwood, he said, struggling to his feet when he saw her approach. You honor my son by coming. I'm so sorry for your loss, Don Roberto. Miguel was a good man. The old blacksmith's eyes filled with tears. But there was something else there, fear, and perhaps suspicion. He was asking questions, Don Roberto said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. About you, about your marriage. Said it wasn't right. A good girl like you forced into such arrangements. Isabella's heart clenched. Miguel had died because of her, because he had tried to investigate or interfere with Blackwood's plans. What kind of questions? About your husband's business, about men who visit him at strange hours. Miguel was always too curious for his own good. The old man's voice broke. Now he's gone, and they say it was an accident, but what, Don Roberto? He leaned closer, his voice barely audible. His horse came back without a scratch, Senora. If Miguel fell in the canyon, if there was a struggle, wouldn't the horse show signs? And Miguel knew those trails better than anyone. He wouldn't have ridden them at night unless he was fleeing from something, Isabella realized. Or someone. She pressed a small bag of coins into the blacksmith's hands, money from her household allowance, but it seemed pitifully inadequate compensation for a young man's life. If you need anything, Don Roberto, please let me know. The old man's fingers closed around the coins. But his eyes held a warning. Be careful, Senora. Your husband is not a man who tolerates interference. Miguel learned that too late. Isabella spent the rest of the morning in town, ostensibly shopping but actually observing. She noticed Blackwood's men everywhere, lounging outside the saloon, standing near the telegraph office, watching the comings and goings of every citizen. Copper Ridge wasn't just influenced by Harrison Blackwood. It was controlled by him. At the general store, she overheard conversations that made her skin crawl. The storekeeper was explaining to a customer why certain supplies were suddenly unavailable. Can't get ammunition from our usual suppliers, he was saying. I have to go through Mr. Blackwood's connections now. Says it's for everyone's safety, preventing weapons from falling into the wrong hands. Another piece of the puzzle. Blackwood was controlling the weapons trade, ensuring that potential opposition remained unarmed while his own men had access to whatever they needed. Isabella returned to the estate that afternoon to find unexpected activity in the courtyard. A magnificent black carriage with federal license plates sat near the front entrance, and well-dressed men in expensive suits were conferring with Blackwood near the stables. Mrs. Whitmore met her at the door, clearly flustered. Ma'am, Senator Richardson has arrived unexpectedly for an inspection tour. Mr. Blackwood requests your immediate presence in the parlor, Isabella's. Heart raced as she recognized the name from the correspondence she had photographed. This was the senator mentioned in El Lobo's letter, the man whose visit would influence territorial appointments. She was about to meet one of the highest-ranking officials complicit in Blackwood's criminal enterprise. She quickly changed into her finest dress and made her way to the parlor, where she found Blackwood entertaining 3 distinguished gentlemen. Senator Richardson was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the practiced smile of a career politician. His companions were introduced as Territorial Governor Phillips and Judge Advocate Morrison, not the corrupt Sheriff Morrison, but a federal official whose presence suggested the conspiracy reached even higher levels of government. Gentlemen, Blackwood said as Isabella entered, my wife, Isabella, My dear, Senator Richardson and his colleagues are touring the territory to assess our readiness for statehood. Isabella curtsied gracefully, her mind racing. If these men were here to evaluate territorial fitness for statehood, and they were connected to Blackwood's criminal enterprise, it suggested corruption at the federal level that went far beyond cattle rustling. A pleasure, Mrs. Blackwood, Senator Richardson said, his eyes appraising her with the calculating gaze of a man who viewed everything as a potential asset. Your husband speaks very highly of your intelligence and discretion. You're too kind, Senator. I hope your visit to our territory proves enlightening. Oh, I'm certain it will, the senator replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your husband has been most informative about local conditions, business opportunities, and the challenges of maintaining order in such a dynamic region. Governor Phillips, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up. The federal government is particularly interested in economic development and population stability. Regions that demonstrate responsible leadership and profitable enterprise are naturally more attractive candidates for statehood. The implications were clear. Blackwood's criminal activities were being presented as legitimate business success, and his iron-fisted control of the territory was being sold as effective governance. I understand you're hosting us for dinner this evening, Judge Advocate Morrison added. I'm looking forward to discussing local legal challenges with your husband. Federal oversight can be flexible when local authorities demonstrate competence. Isabella nodded politely while internally cataloguing every word. These weren't just corrupt local officials. They were federal agents actively collaborating with Blackwood to manipulate the statehood process for personal gain. After the officials retired to their guest quarters to rest before dinner, Blackwood cornered Isabella in the hallway. Tonight's dinner is crucial, he said, his grip on her arm tight enough to leave bruises. These men hold our territory's future in their hands. Any mistakes, any inappropriate comments, any hint that you're anything other than a devoted wife could have catastrophic consequences. I understand completely, husband. Do you? Because Miguel Fernandez thought he understood things too. The poor boy had an unfortunate accident last night. Fell into Canyon Creek in the dark. Such a tragedy when young men overestimate their abilities. The threat was crystal clear. Miguel's death wasn't an accident. It was a message. Cross Harrison Blackwood and accidents happened. How terrible, Isabella managed to say. I'll pray for his family. You do that, Blackwood replied, his cold smile never wavering. And remember that accidents can happen to anyone who finds themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. That evening's dinner was the most important performance of Isabella's life. She played the perfect hostess, charming the corrupt officials while gathering intelligence about the scope of their conspiracy. The conversation revealed a network of corruption that spanned multiple territories, involved dozens of high-ranking officials, and threatened to shape the entire political future of the American West. By the time dessert was served, Isabella had enough evidence to bring down not just Blackwood, but an entire shadow government that was using criminal enterprises to manipulate federal policy. But she also knew that time was running out. The officials would leave tomorrow, taking their secrets with them. Miguel's death had demonstrated the lethal consequences of discovery, and Blackwood's increasingly possessive behavior suggested that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. After the guests retired to their rooms, Blackwood approached Isabella with predatory intent that could no longer be delayed or deflected. My dear wife, he said, his hands already reaching for her, I believe it's time we properly celebrated our union. Isabella's mind raced as Blackwood approached her in the dimly lit hallway, his intentions unmistakable. She had perhaps seconds to act before her cover would be blown and her mission compromised forever. Harrison, she said softly, placing her hand on his chest in what appeared to be an intimate gesture. The guests, shouldn't we ensure they're comfortable first? Senator Richardson seemed quite interested in your collection of territorial maps. Blackwood paused, his political instincts warring with his personal desires. The maps can wait until morning. But think of the impression we could make, Isabella pressed, her voice taking on a conspirative whisper. If you showed him the expansion routes tonight privately, over brandy, he might be more inclined to expedite the statehood process. The suggestion of additional political advantage was enough to give Blackwood pause. Isabella could see him calculating, weighing immediate gratification against potential long-term gains. You may have a point, he conceded reluctantly. Very well. But afterwards, my dear wife, we will not be interrupted again. Isabella nodded demurely, while her heart hammered against her ribs. She had bought herself time, but at a terrible cost, the promise of submission that made her soul recoil. As Blackwood headed back toward the guest quarters, Isabella slipped out to the rose garden. The white cloth signal had been removed from her balcony, which meant Thomas had seen it. She could only hope he was close enough to act when the moment came. 20 minutes later, she heard voices approaching through the darkness. Blackwood was returning with Senator Richardson and Governor Phillips, all three men clearly having enjoyed additional brandy during their private consultation. The beauty of the arrangement, Richardson was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, is that Washington sees only prosperity and order. They don't need to know the details of how that order is maintained. Exactly, Blackwood replied. A few strategic disappearances, some carefully timed accidents, and the troublemakers learn to keep their opinions to themselves. Governor Phillips laughed, the sound cold and brittle. Miguel Fernandez being the most recent example, I assume? Indeed. The boy was asking too many questions about my wife's circumstances. Such romantic notions had to be discouraged. Isabella pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her blood boiling with rage and grief. They were discussing Miguel's murder as casually as they might talk about the weather. What about federal investigators? Phillips asked. Any concerns about interference from Washington? None whatsoever, Blackwood replied confidently. Our mutual friend El Lobo has contacts throughout the Marshal Service. Any inconvenient investigators tend to be reassigned to less troublesome territories. Isabella's heart stopped. If Blackwood had informants within the Federal Marshal Service, Thomas might be walking into a trap. She had to warn him, and had to find a way to signal that his cover might be compromised. The men's voices faded as they moved back toward the house. But Isabella remained hidden in the garden, her mind racing through possibilities. The evidence she had gathered was enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, but only if Thomas could get it to the right people. Officials who hadn't been corrupted by Blackwood's network. A soft whistle from the shadows made her freeze. The sound came again, barely audible above the desert wind. Thomas was here. Isabella waited 5 minutes before moving deeper into the rose garden, following a winding path that led to Sarah Blackwood's grave. Thomas materialized from behind a large marble angel, his face grim in the moonlight. I saw the signal, he whispered. What did you learn? Isabella quickly recounted everything. The photographed documents, the federal officials' involvement, the conversation about Miguel's murder, and most critically, Blackwood's claim about having informants in the Marshal Service. Thomas's expression darkened with each revelation. This is bigger than we imagined. If they have people inside the service, can you trust your backup? The agents you said could help. I think so. But we need to move fast. Tomorrow night, they're expecting a major shipment from El Lobo. If we can intercept that... Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on gravel. Multiple sets of boots, moving with military precision through the garden paths. He knows, Thomas whispered urgently. Somehow he knows about us. Isabella's blood turned to ice as she realized the truth. Blackwood hadn't been fooled by her performance. He had been testing her, watching her, possibly even listening to their previous conversations. This way, Thomas grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the garden, away from the approaching searchers. But they were too late. Lantern light flooded their hiding spot as Jennings, Blackwood's foreman, appeared with 6 armed men. "Well, well," came Blackwood's voice from behind the searching party. "Marshal Thomas Ryder, I presume. And my dear wife, caught in the act of betraying her marriage vows." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Isabella, his hand moving toward his weapon. But the odds were impossible. 7 armed men with lanterns and clear lines of sight against one marshal and an unarmed woman in an open garden. "Very touching," Blackwood continued, emerging into the circle of light. "The noble lawman and the duplicitous wife, united in their foolish crusade for justice." "It's over, Blackwood," Thomas said steadily. "We have enough evidence to destroy your entire operation." "Evidence?" Blackwood laughed, the sound echoing off the marble headstones. "You mean the photographs my dear wife took? The conversations she overheard? I'm afraid that evidence will die with both of you." Isabella felt despair crushing down on her as she realized the scope of Blackwood's knowledge. He had known about their meetings, their mission, possibly everything from the very beginning. "You see," Blackwood continued conversationally, "when one has contacts throughout the Federal Marshal Service, one tends to learn about undercover operations quite quickly. Marshal Ryder's assignment was reported to me 3 days after he arrived in the territory." Thomas's face went pale. "Then why? Why allow the charade to continue?" "Because it served my purposes. I needed to know how much the federal government suspected, who else might be involved, what evidence they might already possess." Blackwood's cold smile was triumphant. "My dear wife proved to be an excellent unwitting agent, gathering intelligence about your operation while believing she was gathering intelligence about mine. The devastating reality hit Isabella like a physical blow. She hadn't been helping to bring down a criminal enterprise. She had been helping it protect itself. Every piece of information she had discovered, every conversation she had overheard, had been carefully orchestrated to reveal the federal investigation's scope and methods. But more than that," Blackwood continued, "you've both provided me with the perfect solution to several problems. The mysterious disappearance of a corrupt federal marshal and his criminal accomplice, my own wife, tragically, will demonstrate to Washington just how dangerous this territory can be for those who don't respect local authority." Jennings raised his rifle, the metal glinting in the lantern light. Isabella closed her eyes, thinking of her family, of Miguel, of Sarah Blackwood and all the other victims of Harrison Blackwood's ruthless ambition. The crack of gunfire split the night air, but it wasn't Jennings who fired. The foreman spun and fell as rifle shots erupted from multiple positions around the garden. Blackwood's men scrambled for cover as muzzle flashes lit the darkness from behind tombstones, rose bushes and garden walls. "Federal marshals," came a commanding voice from the darkness. "Drop your weapons." The battle was brief but decisive. Blackwood's men, caught in crossfire from superior positions, surrendered within minutes. Only Blackwood himself remained defiant, a derringer appearing in his hand as he grabbed Isabella and pressed the small pistol to her temple. "Stay back," he snarled. "I'll kill her." "Harrison Blackwood," Thomas said calmly, his own weapon now drawn, but not aimed at the man holding Isabella hostage. "You're surrounded by federal agents." "It's over. It's never over," Blackwood replied, his voice filled with rage and desperation. "You think you've won? I have contacts in Washington, in the territorial government, throughout the judicial system. Even if you arrest me, I'll be free within a month." "Not this time," came a new voice from the shadows. Senator Richardson stepped into the lamplight, but instead of the corrupt politician Isabella expected to see, his bearing was authoritative, official. "Deputy Marshal Richardson, Federal Investigation Division. The man you've been corresponding with, the one you knew as Senator Richardson, was actually one of my agents." Isabella's mind reeled as the deception became clear. The corrupt officials, the dinner party conversations, even El Lobo's letters, it had all been an elaborate federal sting operation designed to expose the full scope of Blackwood's network. "The real Senator Richardson died 3 months ago," the marshal continued. "We've been using his identity to infiltrate criminal organizations throughout the territory. Every conversation you had, every plan you revealed, every corrupt deal you made, all of it was recorded and witnessed by federal agents. Blackwood's grip on Isabella tightened, the derringer pressing harder against her skull. I'll still kill her, and I'll disappear into Mexico before you can stop me. With what resources? Thomas asked quietly. Your bank accounts have been frozen, your assets seized under federal criminal forfeiture laws. Your men are either under arrest or dead. Your contacts in the Marshal Service were actually our agents, feeding you false information while gathering evidence of your crimes. The devastating truth was evident in Blackwood's expression as he realized the complete collapse of everything he had built. His empire, his power, his carefully constructed network of corruption, all of it had been systematically dismantled while he believed he was in control. Even if you kill Isabella and escape, Thomas continued, where would you go? El Lobo was arrested yesterday in El Paso. Your Mexican contacts were federal agents. Your escape routes lead directly to more marshals waiting to arrest you. Isabella felt Blackwood's hand trembling against her head as the full scope of his defeat became clear. But desperation made him more dangerous, not less. Then we'll all die together, he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. The shot that ended Harrison Blackwood's reign of terror came from an unexpected direction. Molly, the young maid who had served Isabella faithfully, stepped out from behind Sarah Blackwood's tombstone with a smoking rifle in her hands. That's for Mrs. Sarah, she said quietly as Blackwood crumpled to the ground. And for Miguel. And for every person you hurt. Isabella staggered away from Blackwood's fallen form, her legs barely supporting her weight. Thomas caught her as she swayed, his strong arms providing the safety and comfort she had desperately needed for so long. It's over, he whispered against her hair. It's really over. The dawn that broke over Copper Ridge 3 hours later illuminated a territory forever changed. Harrison Blackwood's criminal empire had been completely dismantled, with over 60 arrests made throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. The evidence Isabella had helped gather, combined with the federal sting operation, resulted in convictions that reached all the way to Washington. D.C. Isabella's family ranch was restored to them free and clear. The fraudulent debts cancelled, along with all of Blackwood's other illegal contracts. Don Roberto received compensation for his son's murder, though nothing could truly heal the loss of his boy. Sheriff Morrison and Judge Hawkins were among those arrested, replaced by federal appointees who began the long process of restoring legitimate law and order to the territory. 3 months after that terrible night in the Rose Garden, Isabella stood on the front porch of a small cabin in the Colorado mountains, watching Thomas repair a fence that enclosed their horse pasture. They had married in a simple ceremony, attended by her family, with Father Miguel officiating and federal marshals providing security. The federal government had indeed paid well for Isabella's services, but more importantly, it had given her something she had never expected to find, a future with the man who had changed everything simply by believing she deserved a choice. Thomas looked up from his work and smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something beautiful. He was no longer the mysterious cowboy she had met by a desert campfire, just as she was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold into marriage to save her family. They were partners now, equals who had chosen each other freely. "What are you thinking about?" he called out, wiping sweat from his forehead. Isabella smiled back, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew safely beneath her heart. "I'm thinking about choices," she replied, "and how sometimes the most important ones come disguised as impossibilities." Thomas walked over and took her in his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of freedom, of justice, and of a love that had bloomed in the darkest of circumstances. In the distance, snow-capped peaks reached toward a sky so blue it seemed infinite with possibility. Isabella had traveled from the suffocating desert of Harrison Blackwood's control to these mountains where she could breathe freely, love without fear, and build a life based on her own choices. The cowboy who had saved her had indeed changed everything, but not in the way she had first imagined. He hadn't rescued her from her fate. He had given her the power to rescue herself. And in doing so, he had found his own salvation as well. Their story would be told for generations in the territories that became states, a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and justice could triumph over corruption and cruelty. But for Isabella and Thomas, standing together as the sun set behind the Colorado mountains, the only story that mattered was their own, and it was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.